Brought out the philosopher's turtleneck today, so you know I'm going to be delivering some incredible insights. Or I might pass out and die. This thing's really tight around my neck. It's kind of hard to breathe. What I really want to answer today with today's review is two important questions. Number one, is Dune still a sci-fi classic that should be enshrined in the halls of immortality? Or is it a clunky, racist excursion that should be brushed aside and left in the dustbin of history? And the second one, which is super important, what is it like to actually read Dune in the 21st century? And I'll tell you a huge thing which I think no one has covered or thought about when reading Dune. So one really cynical way to approach and even interrogate this text is a white colonizer from a distant planet manipulates a bunch of POCs, DNF. P.S. It's written by a white guy who does a terrible job of appropriating different Eastern cultures. DNF. 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 And I think Frank Herbert wouldn't have a problem with that interpretation. I think actually if Frank Herbert was writing today, he might even be the person who wrote that interpretation while he was writing something like The Trader Bandu Cormorant. I think another way to approach the text and get some interesting insights from it and experiences out of it is as a sociologist or an anthropologist who has come upon the ruins of a temple buried in the sand for the past 60 years and has uncovered this sort of like ancient artifact. And the biggest question for anyone who's opening this book and starting to read Dune is like, wow, this prose is really different. And wow, these names seem really foreign to me. I literally feel like I'm lost in a desert. I have no idea where I am. I have no idea where these people are. Some of their language seems to make a little bit of sense. Some of it's very foreign and seemingly impossible to ever know or make any sense of at all. So again, if we come to this from like a traditional perspective of I'm going to read a book, it's going to be this very linear experience of word to word, sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph, chapter to chapter, and I'm going to be sort of like smoothly ushered all the way through. Like that's sort of going to be probably everyone's expectation going in. I want the plot to go faster, bro. I want to plot Lambo. But that's exactly the type of reading experience that Dune, I think, is challenging its readers that you can't have. And I think if we use this anthropological understanding of the text of Dune, it really will shine a light on something that everyone, and I mean everyone, has missed about how to read Dune. Okay, so let's talk about plot and pacing. You know, Frank Herbert can write a great sentence. Frank Herbert knows really good words and how to use them and how to use them in a very poetic fashion. So not only can he write sentences, he can write some poetry, he can write some poetic phrases, he can also write a really clean chapter. And there's evidence of this really kind of like towards the back of the book, and there's a couple of chapters where he, I think, deliberately makes things a lot smoother than most of the experience of reading Dune is. So given that, like, why does Dune seem so slow? And the answer to that is something that you can't really tell until you finish the book and you have some time to sort of like recollect on it. But I think that clunkiness, that awkwardness is very much on purpose and is something that Herbert very much intended for his readers to experience. So when we think about plot and what plot is a very powerful tool, and it's owned by someone. A plot is owned by the author. And so the author who owns the plot, who the tool kind of belongs to, they use that tool to create an illusion, to create a myth. And what does this mean in terms of the reading experience in the 21st century? One of the major points of Dune is the critique of power and the critique of power's ability to manipulate stories and narratives that are then sort of pushed down or, deceptively integrated into other populations, right? So when we are constantly when we constantly have to push through the words on the page and do a lot of heavy lifting, that means we're going to be constantly scratching our heads about why in the world are we doing this? What's really going on here? What am I really looking at? So all those questions are important for Dune to create within the reader and within the reading experience, because it doesn't want you to be held captive by an illusion, by a myth. I think that sort of difficulty is actually one of the great things about Dune and one of the great sort of literary experiments that it tries within the science fiction genre. It could also be that I have a philosopher's turtleneck on today. It's very tight and is reducing circulation to my brain. Now, when we think about the world building of Dune, and when you think about sort of like the climate of America or the United States, the climate of America or the United States when this was published, much of the East was still sort of enshrouded in otherness. People just didn't have the same access to other cultures that we now do. And you could even say, like today, only very recently have we really been introduced and heard more from other Eastern and diverse voices. So here we do have to kind of like pause and give Dune its credit for taking this tremendous risk of attempting to weave in Eastern yarns to an American tapestry, especially in the burgeoning genre of science fiction. So Dune's created a very unique and interesting people in Arrakis and fleshed out, their sacred customs, their rituals, their songs, their funeral rites, even, the unique way that they walk through the desert, their reverence of scarce resources. And I think a lot of the Eastern influences add this sort of like a lyrical mystique to it that does help create this otherworldly allure to the world of Dune. Now, is it done perfectly? Of course not. But if we look at it from I think a respectful historical distance, and keep in mind this was created in 1965, then it is something new, exciting, and interesting that really just hasn't been put together in such a clever and unique way before. One final thing I'll say about the Dune universe is I absolutely loved the political maneuvering of the great houses, like the whole dynamic of the great houses, and the like wider cosmic backdrop that the whole Dune narrative takes place within. I wanted to quickly touch on characters. There's a whole bunch of characters that I actually love. The ones I love the most I can't actually talk too much about because they're kind of like major spoilers. But there are a ton of characters that I really just had a great time like getting to know. And one of the unique things about the writing of Dune is there's this sort of like psychological head hopping where you get to see all the different character motivations, even sort of like within a scene as they're all talking to each other. Now, many of the characters do start out just really kind of like flat, I think. But as the narrative progresses, their subjectivities are brought more and more to light, and you start to see, like, you learn more about them, their unique styles and interpretations of the world, and they get interesting to spend time with. The intimacy that sort of like psychological head hopping brings really starts to pay off, I think, towards the later pieces of the book, because the action in Dune is really within the individual. I loved the Baron Harkonnen. He's like this Machiavellian villain who's extremely deceitful, but his power really stems from and his abilities at deceit and sort of like plotting and outthinking people really stems from just how brutally honest he is with himself about who he is and what he likes and what he doesn't like. Also like Fade, I just like the guy's name. Also, as things progressed, I really loved the planetologist. I was pronouncing his name as Keynes, but I'm sure it's like Keynes? Keynes? I have to do a video on this one. How to pronounce the words in Dune. But I really enjoyed getting to know and spending time with, I'm just gonna say Keynes, I'm gonna butcher it, because he's kind of like this dreamer who, he got this like one piece of a vision from his father about the potential that Dune could be, and he kind of pursues this at sort of radical cost to himself. And I think the most surprising thing when it comes to characters is how ambivalent I really was with Paul. But I think, again, going back to, I think this sort of approach of way more of a social scientist instead of just kind of like a consumer of a plot of a story, because those are people getting manipulated, right? So that's something Dune and Frank Herbert are trying to warn us all against and teach us, and potentially teach us all how to navigate or deal with. But Paul, for me, he was interesting, but he wasn't like this dynamic leader. Like, you could definitely see, I can appreciate how he was clever and he's able to sort of obviously have some ability to perceive a situation and try to maneuver it one way or the other. But he wasn't a really engaging protagonist. But again, I think that's by design. You could have given more time to the Baron and he would have stolen the show, despite being a pretty disgusting figure. Which again, I think is one of the virtues of Dune is it writes a believable and functionable protagonist who is billed as the chosen one, but it also does some hand-holding and say, I'm not going to let you so easily fall for the chosen one. You're not just going to out and out love him. This protagonist, Paul, is going to be interesting. There's going to be a bunch of lore built up to sort of boost him, but he's not going to be someone who you fall head over heels for. You're not going to idolize or worship him, but you're going to see how other societies who don't get the same sort of inside look that you do, how they do kind of fall over and worship him and are manipulated by him and other people around him. Okay, so the other big question, is Dune still a classic? Has it maintained its, hallowed status as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, science fiction novel ever written? And that's a huge title to have to live up to year after year after year. So what I think Dune ultimately is a rich or abundant oasis for readers who are looking for character-driven fiction that really has a love of language and therefore is able to sort of take adventures within the English language. It also took huge, enormous risks, trying to bring in very different positions and thinking from other cultures that have been vastly unexplored into the literature of America in the mid-60s. And sure, there's different thinking throughout America going on in the 60s, we all know that. But this is really one of the early moments where, an individual tries to bring some new spice, if you will, into a young genre in America. Dune also knows, in a very uncanny way, the 21st century's demons, and it even anticipates them in such a way that is able to critically question them, even though they aren't technically here yet. It artfully questions power, technology, which of course is intimately related with power, myth, fate, time, and really the weakness of a certain species to ever free itself from certain dependencies or make significant changes without huge amounts of bloodshed, mayhem, and destruction. And so for all those reasons, Dune is absolutely still a classic of science fiction literature, if not the essence of science fiction itself. I want the plot to go faster, bro. I want to plot Lambo.